Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into something totally fascinating. We're going to look at a massive historical transformation. Specifically, how early, highly dynamic, and honestly pretty subversive spiritual movements slowly shifted into rigid, institutional dogmas over the centuries. Now, just to be clear up front, we aren't here to judge theology today. We're just impartially looking at the historical record to see exactly how faith evolved into structured systems of power.
So right off the bat, here's the big question we need to ask. Why do dynamic spiritual movements freeze into rigid dogmas of power? As we go through the source material today, I really want you to keep this question in the back of your mind, because as you'll see, the answer isn't actually about dry theological history. It's entirely about fundamental human psychology.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is the thematic journey we are taking today to understand 5 major historical shifts. We'll look at the need for control, the introduction of law, power and monopoly, the fear of modernity, the commodification of grace, and finally, the illusion of certainty.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the need for control, where psychology meets theology. To truly understand history, we have to start with the human brain's total discomfort with uncertainty. When we look at these historical shifts, the source text makes a really crucial point. These rigid dogmas didn't just pop up out of malice. There wasn't some evil mastermind pulling the strings. They arose out of totally natural human psychology. We deeply desire safety, we want control, and we absolutely crave simple answers to impossibly complex questions. When early believers faced chaos and persecution, they didn't scheme. They just sought institutional power out of fear, simply to create a safe, predictable harbor.
Well, that psychological need for structure leads us perfectly into Section 2, Law, Power, and Monopoly. This is the first big shift.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the early clash of mindsets. Picture the 3rd century. In the West, Latin theology was heavily shaped by a guy named Tertullian. And here's the kicker, he was a lawyer. So he introduced straight-up courtroom terms into faith: merit, satisfaction, debt. Contrast that with the Eastern Church. They used the language of medicine. They saw sin as an illness, God as a doctor, and salvation as a healing process. But in the West, that legal framework really began to take root.
And that legalistic seed really blossomed in the 11th century with Anselm of Canterbury. Living in a strict feudal society, Anselm built a theology entirely based on feudal honor. He argued that human sin offended an infinite divine honor, and therefore it required an infinite transactional payment. This mechanically transformed faith into a system of infinite debt. And this framework eventually paved the logical way for the medieval sale of indulgences, where prayer and forgiveness literally became a financial transaction.
So, while the theology was becoming legalized, the physical church was becoming militarized. Just look at this timeline. Before 313 AD, Christianity was illegal, heavily persecuted, and followers were largely pacifist. But just a few decades later, by 380 AD, it's the sole state religion of the Roman Empire. And by the 5th century, thinkers like Augustine are outlining the theology of the just war. It is a stark, incredible pivot from a persecuted minority to a state-sponsored powerhouse actively justifying violence.
And this era birthed an ideology that still resonates with us today: Caesaropapism. It's a big word, but basically, a theologian named Eusebius formulated a political system that effectively merged church and state. Suddenly, the Roman emperor was viewed as the earthly image of God. The empire itself was seen as a reflection of the heavenly kingdom. This permanently intertwined state and church power, and it deeply impacted Eastern Orthodoxy right up to our modern geopolitical day. This next point brilliantly illustrates how power just totally shifts language. Back in the 3rd century, during some brutal persecutions, Bishop Cyprian coined the phrase, "Outside the church, there is no salvation." But listen, this wasn't arrogance. It was a desperate pastoral plea. He basically meant, don't leave the ship in a storm, stay together. But fast forward to the 14th century. The church is a massive, wealthy power. Pope Boniface VIII takes that exact same phrase and transforms it into an absolute dogma of political submission. So a comforting pastoral plea literally morphed into a bureaucratic tool for medieval control over European kings. Crazy, right?
Moving right along to Section 3, the fear of modernity. Let's look at the fundamentalist panic.
There's this massive modern myth that historical Christians always read the Bible entirely literally. They absolutely did not. Actually, ancient foundational thinkers like Origen and Augustine strictly warned against reading creation texts literally if they contradicted observable nature and reason. They completely championed a symbolic, allegorical, and highly intellectual reading of Scripture.
So what on earth changed? Well, Enter the trauma of modernity. Imagine the 18th and 19th centuries. You have the Enlightenment, modern natural sciences, Darwin's theory of evolution. These were perceived as massive, existential threats to the established worldview. And the reaction? Pure psychological panic. Certain segments of American Protestantism, specifically, reacted by building massive anti-intellectual defensive walls to protect their faith from what they saw as an onslaught of modern science.
And they gave that defensive wall a name: inerrancy, emerging in the late 19th century from what is known as Princeton theology. This doctrine claimed absolute biblical infallibility, not just in matters of faith, but in areas of literal history and science. This was a very specific, modern defense mechanism. It deformed historical faith by turning an ancient text into a rigid, factual encyclopedia dictated directly by God. And unfortunately, it forced believers into a false choice between intellectual integrity and religious belonging.
All right, jumping into the modern era with Section 4, the commodification of grace. Let's talk about the prosperity gospel.
This is the youngest of the historical shifts we're covering today. And get this, the roots of the prosperity gospel don't actually lie in historical theology at all. They stem from a 19th century secular philosophical movement in the U.S. called New Thought. It preached the power of positive thinking, basically the idea that what you speak becomes reality. Then, in the 20th century, this esoteric psychology fused with Pentecostalism, totally blending secular mind-over-matter ideas with biblical texts about blessing.
And it all logically builds into what the source material cleverly calls the cosmic vending machine. It is literally a strict transactional formula. Step 1, you make a positive verbal confession. Step 2, you make a financial gift or a seed to the institution. Step 3, you are guaranteed health and wealth in return. This theology transforms faith into an invisible currency. It reduces the concept of a divine, loving parent into a mechanical vending machine that is literally obligated to dispense goods if you just pull the right levers.
Okay, we've covered a ton of ground today, from ancient Rome to modern America. Let's bring this explainer home with Section 5, the illusion of certainty. Here is your core takeaway.
The absolute crucial point comes down to this. We started by asking why dynamic faith turns into rigid dogma. The answer? Our desperate need for control and safety. To make the unknown manageable, humanity systematically reduced the deep mystery of faith. Think about it. We turned God into an accountant tracking infinite depths. We turned the church into a militarized empire. We turned the ancient, symbolic Bible into a modern scientific encyclopedia. And we turned faith into a manipulatable currency.
Which leaves us with this final, kind of profound question for you to chew on today. Is it easier for us, psychologically, to rely on a rigid system of rules, powerful institutions, and transactional equations? Or is it harder, but maybe way more authentic, to leave an uncertain, intimate trust with the great unknown? I'll let you think on that one. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the history behind the ideas we take for granted. Catch you next time.